It started as a whisper in the European countryside, a low rumble on the horizon that every German patrol had learned to fear. A sound too light to be a tank, too fast to be a truck. It was the growl of the American M8 Greyhound, a machine that didn't look like much, but could turn the tide of a skirmish before most soldiers even realized what hit them. To the Germans, it was a scout car, a nuisance, nothing more. A lightly armored, six-wheeled curiosity that darted along the roads and fields, usually far ahead of the main Allied columns. They call them Sparhe scouts, because that's exactly what they seem to be, eyes of the advancing armies, not claws. But that illusion shattered fast, when those eyes started shooting back. The M8 Greyhound was born from necessity, designed not to fight, but to see. In 1941, the US Army needed a fast, nimble armored car that could race ahead of infantry and tanks, identify enemy positions, and relay vital information. It had to be quick enough to outrun danger, yet sturdy enough to survive the occasional ambush. The result was something no one expected, a light, sleek, and deadly hybrid of speed and firepower. Built by Ford and introduced in 1943, the M8 came with 6 wheels, a powerful Hercules JXD engine, and most importantly, a 37mm M6 gun mounted in its open-top turret. At first glance, that gun seemed laughably small next to the German armor that dominated the battlefields of Europe. Panthers, Tigers, even half-tracks looked like monsters compared to this fragile little machine. But war has a way of rewriting expectations. When American armored divisions rolled into Europe after D-Day, the M8S led the way, scouting roads, probing defenses, and moving like ghosts through ruined villages. They were fast, terrifyingly fast for their size, capable of reaching speeds of over 55 miles per hour on roads. And for German troops used to lumbering tanks and slow-moving half-tracks, that speed made the M8 something strange and unpredictable. At first, German soldiers laughed. They'd see the 6-wheeled Greyhounds dart across open ground and vanish into the tree line, thinking these were just reconnaissance toys, unarmed scouts too fragile to threaten anyone. That illusion was shattered the first time an M8 opened fire. The 37mm cannon might not have pierced the thick armor of a Tiger or a Panther, but against lighter German vehicles like SD, KFZ, 251 half-tracks, or armored cars, it was devastating. The Greyhound could fire armor-piercing shells fast and accurately, turning German transports into burning wrecks before slipping away into the smoke. Word spread quickly among German ranks. Those little scout cars weren't just watching anymore, they were hunting. By late 1944, entire German patrols had begun to fear the silhouette of the M8. It didn't roar like a Sherman, nor did it leave the thunderous tracks of a tank. It whispered across the fields, struck fast, and vanished before the Germans could even line up a counterattack. To the Wehrmacht, it became a symbol of the shifting tide where American mobility and daring began to outmaneuver brute German strength. Yet behind that sleek machine was a story of improvisation and courage. The men who drove and fought in M8 weren't tankers. They were scouts, radio operators, and driver soldiers trained to observe, not engage. But as the war pressed on, the lines blurred. In the chaos of advancing through France, Belgium, and into Germany, every soldier had to fight, and the M8 crews learned to turn their fragile vehicles into weapons of opportunity. They sneak around flanks, find soft targets, supply trucks, mortar teams, command cars, and strike without warning. Using their speed and agility, they could retreat before heavier armor arrived. The Germans couldn't believe it. To them, these scout cars were behaving like ambush predators, hit and run, ghosts that dismantled their columns piece by piece. The Greyhound wasn't perfect. Its armor could barely stop a rifle bullet from close range, and its open turret made the crew vulnerable to grenades, snipers, or shrapnel. But it had one advantage that numbers couldn't show confidence. Its crews trusted the machine's speed, its gun, and most importantly, each other. And when you have a team that believes they can outrun death itself, you've created something powerful. There are countless accounts from the European front. Dusty, half-forgotten reports from small villages where lone M8s held intersections, delayed enemy convoys, or ambushed columns much larger than themselves. One German officer captured near the Siegfried Line reportedly told his interrogators that his men called them ghost cars, not because they were silent, but because they seemed to appear out of nowhere, strike, and vanish before you could respond. But what made the M8 truly remarkable wasn't just its speed or firepower. It was how it embodied a changing philosophy of war. The old, slow, iron-bound doctrines were giving way to something faster, something that valued movement over armor, agility over brute force. The Greyhound represented that shift, the idea that victory didn't always belong to the heaviest machine, but to the smartest, quickest one. Still, the M8 wasn't invincible. Against German anti-tank weapons, its thin armor was no match. A single Panzerfaust hit could rip it apart. But those same German troops quickly learned that catching one was another story. By 1945, as the Allies pushed deeper into the Reich, the M8's legend had grown. It was more than a scout, now it was a symbol of relentless momentum, the forward edge of Allied powers sweeping across Europe. And to the Germans, every sighting of that six-wheel silhouette carried a single chilling truth. If the scouts were here, the tanks weren't far behind. Yet within that story of steel and gunfire lies something more personal. The human heartbeat inside those machines. The men inside an M8 knew their odds. They knew one well-placed round could end it all. But they also knew that, without them, the army would be blind. They drove into the unknown, not because they had to, but because someone had to lead the way. And in doing so, they turned a vehicle meant only to see into one that changed the way the enemy fought back. The Germans called them scouts. The Allies called them Greyhounds. But on the battlefield, both sides came to understand something far more profound. This little armored car had teeth, and soon those teeth would bite hard enough to cripple German mobility itself. As the war pressed deeper into Europe, the M8 Greyhound earned a reputation that spread faster than the columns it scouted for. To German troops, it wasn't just a machine, it was a message. Wherever they saw one, they knew the American advance wasn't far behind. In the early summer of 1944, shortly after the breakout from Normandy, small M8 reconnaissance units were often the first to test the limits of enemy resistance. They drive ahead of the main force, engines whispering through hedgerows, the gunners scanning for movement, while the commander kept one hand on the radio. Sometimes they'd stumble into entire German convoys, and instead of turning back, they'd open fire. The 37mm M6 cannon mounted on the Greyhound wasn't meant to duel with tanks, but it didn't have to. Against German half-tracks and light vehicles, it was lethal. The shells would punch clean through the side armor, explode inside, and leave a burning shell where soldiers had stood seconds earlier. One shot and a column of German transports could be thrown into chaos. Reports began to surface across the front. In Belgium, near Namur, a patrol of 2 M8s ambushed a German supply line by hiding behind the hedgerow. When the first half-track rolled past, the lead Greyhound fired a single 37mm round that tore through its side. The second M8 joined in, turning the narrow country road into a trap. Within 2 minutes, the convoy was in flames. By the time the Germans realized what was happening, the M8s were gone, engines howling in the distance. The pattern repeated itself again and again. The Greyhounds would strike where the enemy felt safe, crossroads, bridges, small towns, always from unexpected angles. The Germans quickly learned that when the half-track went up in smoke, somewhere out there, a Greyhound was watching. But the story of the M8 wasn't just about ambushes and hit-and-run tactics. It was about evolution, how a scout car became something far greater than its design intended. The 37mm gun wasn't the only trick up its sleeve. The M8 also carried a 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the turret for anti-air and close defense. When the terrain got too tight, or the 37mm ran out of shells, crews switched to that heavy gun, and it tore through soft targets and infantry like lightning. Many crews even modified their Greyhounds on the field. Some welded extra armor plates to the front, scavenged from wrecked German vehicles, Others mounted camouflage nets or spare wheels for extra protection. The men knew what they were driving, a fast but fragile beast, and they made it their own. One of the most famous M8 encounters took place in France when the American recon platoon stumbled into a German column of half-tracks and armored cars on a narrow road. Outnumbered and outgunned, the M8 crews decided to use their speed instead of firepower. They reversed down the road at full throttle, firing the 37mm on the move shells, slamming into the lead half-track and blocking the entire convoy. Then they looped around through a field, flanking the column, and struck again from the rear. By the time the smoke cleared, German forces had lost half their vehicles and the M8S hadn't taken a single casualty. That was the kind of fight the Greyhound was made for: quick, deadly, and precise. But behind the battlefield success was a strange irony. The US Army had never meant for the M8 to be a frontline brawler. It was a reconnaissance vehicle, a set of eyes meant to observe and report. Yet by 1945, the Greyhound had become one of the most feared wheeled vehicles on the Western Front. German half-tracks, especially the SD, KFZ 251, were once seen as untouchable compared to Allied light vehicles. But the M8 changed that perception completely. With its 37mm AP shells and blistering speed, it could close the gap and strike before the enemy even turned their guns around. Half-tracks became easy prey. One after-action report from the 82nd Recon Battalion described it simply: enemy considers M8 a threat to armored cars and half-tracks, treats them as tanks. Imagine that, a 13-ton armored car with paper-thin armor, now being seen as a tank by the enemy. That was respect earned the hard way. Still, for all its victories, the M8 carried its own dangers. The open-top turret left crews exposed to shrapnel and snipers. A single well-aimed shot from a Panzerfaust or an anti-tank rifle could destroy it instantly. Many crews had close calls, shells whistling past inches away, glass shattering, the engine roaring as they slammed gears to escape. But they didn't slow down. They couldn't. Their mission wasn't just survival, it was information. They had to find the enemy, identify strong points, report artillery positions, and if that meant taking risks, they took them without hesitation. By the winter of 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge erupted across Belgium and Luxembourg, the M8 was everywhere, often out in front, cutting through snow-covered forests and frozen villages. These men were the first to spot advancing German armor, the first to radio back warnings, the first to face ambushes. Many never came back. But for every loss, the Germans paid dearly. It was during this bitter winter that German troops truly began to dread the 37mm gun. The weapon's armor-piercing rounds could tear through the side of their half-tracks like paper. The explosions left behind blackened hulks scattered across white snow. Some German units began referring to the M8S as Rollende Hellenhunde rolling hellhounds. Even as late as spring 1945, when the Allies pushed toward the Rhine, the M8's legend continued to grow. It wasn't just the weapon, it was the men inside. They'd learned every trick in the book: how to use smoke shells to cover retreat, how to lure German patrols into kill zones, how to fake radio chatter to confuse enemy command. They fought smarter, not heavier. And as the war neared its end, one truth became clear: the M8 had become a symbol of the Allied advance. It represented everything the German army could no longer match: mobility, adaptability, and courage under fire. After the war, soldiers who had fought in Greyhounds remembered them with mixed emotions, pride and fear blended together. They'd seen what the machine could do, but they'd also seen what it cost. Every M8 crew knew how fragile their armor was, how thin the line between life and death could be when facing German firepower. But that never stopped them. And for the Germans, the memory of those scout cars lingered long after the fighting stopped. To them, the M8 had been a small, underestimated enemy that refused to play by the rules, a machine that blurred the line between reconnaissance and combat. It wasn't the biggest or the strongest vehicle on the battlefield, but it proved something vital: that speed, precision, and courage could make even the lightest machine a giant killer. By the end of the war, the M8 Greyhound had destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles, liberated countless villages, and scouted paths that no tank could reach. It earned its place not just in military history, but in the memories of those who lived to tell its story. And yet, one final chapter remained the moments when the Greyhound's bite went beyond half-tracks and turned into something far more shocking, when it faced German armor head-on and lived to tell about it. That's where the legend truly turned into myth. By the spring of 1945, Europe was burning itself out. Town after town lay in ruins, bridges shattered, and the echo of engines haunted the empty roads. Among those echoes, the M8 Greyhound still rode leading columns, scouting rivers, and clearing the last desperate German resistance. It had survived through every kind of terrain, every kind of weather, and every kind of enemy. But in those final months, the Greyhound story reached its most unlikely and most dangerous chapter. It happened more than once and always by accident. An M8 patrol scouting far ahead would turn a corner and find itself staring at something it was never meant to face. A German tank, a Panzer IV, sometimes even a Panther, the kind of armor monster that could shred the Greyhound with a single shot. In that moment, every second counted. The crew didn't panic, they reacted. Smoke grenades popped, gears slammed, and the 37mm gun fired, not to destroy, but to distract. Sometimes, against all odds, the Greyhound struck a weak spot, the thin rear armor or the turret ring, and the tank erupted in flames. Those rare kills became the stuff of legend. One of the most incredible stories came from France in late 44. A Greyhound from the 82nd Recon Battalion came face to face with a German Panther while crossing a narrow street. The amazed commander shouted for reverse, but the driver was boxed in rubble behind, tank ahead. There was no escape. So they did the unthinkable. They aimed for the Panther's rear. As it turned, fired 3 rapid rounds, and somehow, impossibly hit a gap in the armor near the engine deck. The Panther stopped moving. Smoke poured out. Against every law of survival, the M8 had killed a tank. The gunner later said he didn't even realize what he'd done until hours after. He was too busy trying not to die. Those moments didn't happen often, but when they did, they shattered every German assumption. The M8, the scout car, the fragile, 6-wheeled nuisance could kill if it had to. And the Germans learned the hard way that underestimating it was a fatal mistake. Even in the last days of the war, when fuel was scarce and morale was low, the Greyhound kept moving. It led convoys across the Rhine, patrolled captured roads, and hunted pockets of resistance. Its crews were exhausted, battered by months of frontline service, yet they never stopped pushing forward. In those final weeks, something remarkable happened. The Greyhound's role evolved yet again. It became not just a scout, not just a fighter, but a liberator. In towns across Germany and Czechoslovakia, civilians watched as those 6-wheeled silhouettes appeared first, long before the tanks or infantry arrived. To them, the M8 was the first sign that the nightmare was ending. Its speed, once a weapon, now became a symbol of hope. And when the guns finally fell silent, the M8's work wasn't done. It continued serving in Europe, in Asia, and later in conflicts all around the world, from Korea to Vietnam, from Africa to Latin America. Nations everywhere adopted it, modified it, and trusted it. Because by then, the legend was known. If you wanted a machine that could survive on speed, courage, and sheer willpower, you built a Greyhound. But no story about the M8 is complete without remembering the men inside. They were often the youngest soldiers, barely out of training, handed a map, a radio, and a 6-wheeled machine that was as much a gamble as a weapon. They learned on the job, one skirmish at a time, trusting. Instinct more than manuals. They called themselves eyes of the army, and in a sense, that's exactly what they were. They saw things first. The enemy, the destruction, the risk. And yet, they drove on. There's a famous quote from a Greyhound commander written after the war: "We weren't heroes. We were just the first ones there." Simple words, but they carry the weight of a generation that moved through fire and steel without hesitation. And for the German soldiers who faced them, the memory never faded. Many survivors later admitted that the speed and audacity of those light armored cars unnerved them more than heavier Allied tanks. Tanks could be predicted, countered, destroyed. But the M8s, they appeared from nowhere, fired, vanished. They turned the battlefield into a place of shadows where the enemy was fast, invisible, and unrelenting. That's why, even decades later, veterans still recall the name with a mix of respect and disbelief. The M8. Greyhound was never supposed to be a killer. It was supposed to observe. But the war demanded more and it answered. With a 37mm gun that tore through half-tracks with a speed that outran death itself. With the courage of crews who fought every day knowing a single mistake could mean the end. It didn't have the thick armor of a Sherman or the firepower of a tank destroyer. But it didn't need those things. It had something rarer versatility. The ability to adapt, to survive, to strike where it mattered most. And maybe that's why its story endures. Because in every war, the machines that last are not the biggest or the loudest, they're the ones that find a way to matter. When historians look back at the Allied push through Europe, they often focus on the tanks, the bombers, the great clashes of steel. But somewhere between those giants, quietly, the M8 Greyhound was doing its job, moving fast, hitting hard, and leaving the enemy guessing. It was the scout that became the hunter, the underdog that refused to die. So when German troops called them scouts, they weren't wrong, but they didn't realize that these scouts had claws sharp enough to cripple their war machine. By the time the dust settled and the smoke cleared, one truth was left behind on every battlefield the M8 had touched. Sometimes, the smallest silhouette on the horizon can carry the deadliest intent. And for those who ever faced the Greyhound, that sound of 6 wheels rolling through the fog would never be forgotten.